Today's interview is with Joshua Goldberg. We ought to call this episode all about joy and risk because that's what we end up talking a lot about. But in fact, what we're looking at is a really unique insight into the work and the history of one of the people that was actually there at the very beginnings of live computer-based video art within the club scene. So, without a lot of introduction, since he gives us plenty of introduction on his own, here's Joshua Goldberg. All right, this week we're meeting with Joshua Goldberg. Joshua is a guy I've known forever in some fashion, I feel. And I think it's one of these kind of relationships that occurs because you see a person a lot on a mailing list and you feel like you know them, even if you haven't met them in person that much. We've met in person a couple of times, but most of our interactions have been virtual. Joshua, hello.
Hello, Darwin. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being part of our podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Why don't we start off by having you give us a little bit of background, where you come from?
I grew up in D.C. I went to a small school in Western Massachusetts called Hampshire College, where I was thoroughly convinced that all I was going to do with my life was direct plays. I got particularly interested towards the end of my time there in the work of Samuel Beckett, and very interested in the idea that there were elements of human motion and the world that could be removed from their context and simply looked at in a kind of abstract form. And I got really into the idea of just isolating parts of human movement to the point where if you look at it, if you look at a word too closely, that word starts to change and becomes other things. I felt like that it was the same way with very, very small parts of human motion and human interaction. And then I moved to New York and realized that I hated absolutely everybody who I thought I was going to be working in the theater world with, and kind of regrouped. I was living with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and I worked a temp job, and I sort of enjoyed just living in the city without actually having any direction. But by the time 97 rolled around, I was really starting to miss art. I wasn't doing any art. I was occasionally seeing plays, but I was isolated from it.
Right.
And I cold called a theater company called Threelegged Dog, and I said, listen, you guys seem to be doing interesting work. I would love to just come and be your lackey. And so I was. I was Kevin Cunningham's assistant on a couple of plays in 96, 97, 98, and I was like the general chief cook and bottle washer for this nascent company as they were getting off the ground with a couple of their productions. And that was really invaluable experience, not only because it actually brought me back into the theater world, but also because I started doing video. My experience with video had been very poor in college because my dirty little secret is I really hate editing. I don't think there's anything more boring than editing and making decisions about how to process work that's been previously recorded. I like seeing these things go in the immediate moment, and maybe that's I think that's theater coming, or maybe that's just an astoundingly short attention span. But I'm not a big fan of editing, and seeing the possibility of using live video in a theatrical context was a lot of fun.
Sure.
And so I did finally end up directing a couple of plays in the city. And then the day after a very successful Fringe show that I directed closed, I entered ITP. I entered NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program.
Right.
And what I said when I entered ITP was that, first off, not only did I not want to do anything that I'd done before, but I really actively wanted to stay away from anything that was regarded as a marketable skill. I said this walking in. I said, maybe I'll do sculpture, or maybe I'll well, I don't know. I couldn't figure it out, but I played around just writing these funny little bits of sort of abstract code and director, and writing these little art projects. But what really grabbed me, and it's funny, but it's true. Is I actually saw a Max patch in action, and I said, wow, I don't know what I want to make, but I want to make it with that. It's that's exactly the way code should work. You should see this flowchart as program. What a great idea. And I started doing a lot of little individual sound experience, like the standard MSP one-offs. You make drones or noise or things like that. And I just loved this because one of my hobbies when I'd been in high school was just a huge interest in 20th century music. And I hadn't actually gone back to that interest since I was in my teens. And so this 10-year hiatus from it brought back memories of just how extraordinary the things that people were doing were in the modern classical electroacoustic electronic world.
Right.
And that was just a true pleasure. But I really got into it when I realized that there was a possibility of doing video with it. And so I jumped off the deep end and I took a plunge and I said, yeah, I'm going to buy NN software. And the thing about it was that in order to get a discount on it, I'd actually somehow managed to convince 5 other people at ITP to buy this. And because we were just given this almost inscrutable, did you ever see the NATO manual?
I have bumped up against it. Yes, I did.
Okay, so this unbelievably hostile piece of software has just been dumped in our laps, and everyone's like, "Well, what do I do with it?" And I felt extremely driven to teach people how to use it and show people what the potentials were, if only because I convinced people to drop so much money in this thing. So right. I started a regular sequence of doing of showing people how to use this and what was possible with NATO, and I started publishing the results, and people were increasingly interested in using it. I used it for a couple of projects on the floor at ITP and the shows, and then I graduated from ITP, and the day after I graduated, I got a call from Parsons, who was interested in the possibility of my teaching students how to use NATO. And I was like, oh, this is great. This will be easy. And then 6 days later, the insanely hostile, multi-headed NetArt identity project that was NN decided that I was terrible. and I think it had to do with the fact that I was actually publishing how-to guides.
And you also did sort of like a review online that I think...
That review was Jeremy, not me.
Oh, that was Jeremy. Oh, all right.
Yeah. Jeremy had the definitive, this is what you can do with NATO document up at Boot Squad. But what I had was, this is how you go through the insanely stupid process of registering it. And this is how you... And this is how you go through the stupid process of installing it correctly. And these are these are a couple of different individual tips and tricks that you can do. And boy, did they hate that, because they liked the idea of it being somewhat inscrutable. That not only did you have to pay the money, but also solve certain problems to get to the temple. And a lot of what I did in those early days, in like the early part of the 2000s, vis-a-vis Max and video, was to try to destroy the temple. I hated the idea of people being able to charge a great deal of money for things that should be that should be naturally available. I mean, I kind of off of probably the most important object when I first started doing visuals for me was the port of the bomb to Max. You remember that?
No, I don't.
Okay, so you know who Scott Draves is? He of the Electric Sheep. All right, so yes. Spot had this amazing open source video instrument in the late 90s called The Bomb, which was an app that could be launched, and it was keyboard controlled. And David Z ported this thing to a Max object. And this was a huge deal for me. And I actually I used The Bomb, and I used NATO's somewhat peculiar way of pulling content from the screen to filter the work that The Bomb was doing. So it was this weird combination of NATO and The Bomb. And I first got shut down by NN for providing help files, which actually made me say I cannot teach at Parsons, because I cannot in any kind of good faith provide any more money or support for these people who are now telling half of the world that I'm a short, fat, stupid, balding, whatever.
Right. Yeah, we all got lumped into that pile.
Yeah, well, that's super fun, right?
It was awesome.
So I said, listen, if it's something, I know that something else is going to come down the pike because this is unsustainable, and this is a programming method that is waiting for someone to figure out video, and when they do, I'll be back. And then a couple of months later, I got an invite to David Rokeby's joyfulness beta,
Right.
and then Josh gave me an invite to Jitter, and I started working on. I started trying to figure out what was going on. Now, here's the thing. I told you earlier about the idea of building systems, of sort of improvising systems.
Right.
And I feel like this is a kind of it's idiosyncratic to the way that I work. It may be idiosyncratic to the way that people actually a lot of people use Macs. But
why don't you explain what you're talking about? Because I'm
all right. I'll get there.
Okay.
So I knew that there were many things in Macs that I didn't understand, and I started writing patches that included these objects that I didn't understand that were somehow coming onto results that I didn't understand but somehow worked. And I liked making machines that did certain things. And I would make a machine that did a feedback pattern, or I'd make a machine that would scrape together and just show a lot of images that were in a folder randomly. But more than anything else, like the first thing that really attracted me to Max and Max as a video creation environment was that I could put randomness into it. Right. And I never had the ability when I was programming to really sort of push the button and watch the randomness occur in ways that could be stored. I mean, a little bit with Director, which was the environment, which was the quote professional unquote environment that I was using, but I wasn't really able to build these random systems until I actually started dealing with NATO and then saw VNS and Jitter, and that was just hugely seductive, hugely seductive, because it's the opposite of editing, right? So with editing, you have many sequences and clips that you whose nature you kind of understand, and you're trying to work to assemble those into a coherent whole. Right. As opposed to the other way around, when you build these systems for improvisation, where you've got a whole collection of happy accidents and glitches and mistakes that you can kind of marshal into something that starts to feel coherent, but by actually linking them together with code as opposed to recording all these things and putting and looking at them afterwards. This goes back to theater. So the problem with theater is that theater, it's all in the moment, and you feel like every aspect of theater that works is because you were actually in the moment. You are looking at these events occurring, and you are in the moment with them. If you videotape theater, or you videotape dance, or you videotape live performance, it is never as good, even if the performances were flawless.
Yeah, I totally agree that the in-the-moment thing is so important. I work with a couple of dance companies, and that is so much the case. There's such disappointment if you look at a videotape of it for anything other than to critique how you're going to do the next performance. The place thing is so critical to a sense of there being value there.
It's because it's exciting in the moment, right? So all of a sudden something happens that's unexpected, and you get an adrenaline rush because you've got this unexpected thing that you're hoping to be able to exploit, and your audience may get an adrenaline rush if only because they're along the journey with you. Right. They're with you there, and man, it doesn't matter how good I felt when I was making when I was making these accidental journeys. Inevitably, when I would go back and look at them outside of the context of the actual performance, there'd be so much to critique and so much to really hate about it. And it would just, and at first it really cast me into depression. I was like, wow, no matter how good I feel when I'm making this, maybe it's really crap. Because every time I go back and I look at it, it's kind of crappy.
Right. Right.
And that was such a weird being able to step back and say, okay, no, it's not crap when it's in the moment, and it's not. It serves a purpose in a way that is important when in that moment, and you need to be okay with that, because it's not like everyone is looking at you and saying, wow, what he's doing is crap. They're kind of with you. If they're there with you, then they really are with you.
Right. There's some of the performances that I've both attended as well as put on, and then had the opportunity to view the material afterwards, really points to how pathetic the mechanisms we have to document it are. Because, again, as you said, that adrenaline rush, there's no way to really generate that in a videoed performance. No. I mean, even if you're able to provide like additional emotional pull through music or some other means, it's just not the same. It's
really not.
And I sometimes wonder if it's not only your adrenaline rush, but your sense of the pheromone discharges of all the people around you.
Now, you're talking about pheromones. This is why I like working in clubs. I like working in clubs because there is a way that I like having my work add to the synthesis of the entire package, of the entire entire feel. So I love it. I mean, it's crazy to say it, but honestly, my favorite audience are the kids on drugs, because I like it when the reaction to my work, which is and always will be abstract. I avoid stories like the plague, and I like light, and I like motion, and I like movement, and I respect the power of abstraction, and I flee very, very fast from telling coherent stories. And I think that stories are great, but I want to make feels. I don't want to make tales. And I think that the people who are most open to these kind of experiences are the people who are standing up and dancing, whether or not they're sober. If they're actually moving their body and they are seeing and hearing the whole experience of what's provided in a club, then that is, you can make such an amazing impact. You can make at its most harmless and least connected, it's just a bunch of screensaver type stuff. And I've had people many, many times over the years saying your stuff just looks like screensavers. I'm just like, well, is that bad? You've obviously, there are some screensavers that you truly enjoy. And people say, oh yeah, and I said, so what's the problem with putting this in a live context? They're not, screensavers aren't necessarily about something, but they make you feel a certain way because you're looking at it, and they're mostly being generated in real time.
Right.
So I don't really have a problem with the screensaver thing, even if it is sometimes directed. It may be an aggressive declaration of how people see my work, but I don't really consider it an insult. Well, you didn't spend a long time looking at the damn toasters,
Right. Well, I wonder what I sometimes wonder how people enjoy the process when it tends to be narrative based, because and an analogy I would make is it has to be difficult to be like a comedian who has to obsessively prepare your jokes and then deliver them the same way every night. Because after some period of time, you must just get sick of your joke, and even if it's a good joke, the fact is you can't deliver it with any kind of emotion because you're tired of it.
Oh, you better believe it. You show that same clip 3 times, and then it's just you
never want to see it again.
Never want to see it again. And again, it's the editing problem. Oh my God.
Right.
Nothing will make me hate the source the source content of a project that I'm dealing with more than looking at the same clip 3 times. It kills all joy.
Right. I hear that. So I want to talk a little bit about the club activity and VJing type work, because from my perspective, you were one of the people who was in the early game of doing live visuals, live VJ type things, live real time production in a club environment. Would you say that's true?
I would say that I'm the second. I am part of the second wave of laptop visualists. The very first people who I saw doing visuals with a laptop, doing improvisatory work on a laptop using computers, specifically using Max as a framework. I didn't really understand that what I had with NATO was the capability of building a video instrument, a live video instrument. I just didn't get that until I had an installation as part of this thing, the Trans Cinema 00 event at Here Arts Center on 6th Avenue in New York. And I put a version of this piece that I'd been building, which involved pulling actors' voices out of static. But the main event, as far as I was concerned, was the live visualist performance. And that evening, I saw Jeremy Bernstein and Kurt Rolski improvising audio and video. They swapped off. So one of them would be doing video, and one of them would be doing audio, and then they'd swap off. Okay. And they were just using their laptops and to generate all of this video and using this custom interface. And I thought, oh my God, that's what it's for. That's what it's for. That's what all of this is leading up to, is that they're instruments, and you could build the instruments. And it blew my mind. The work that they showed that night, I don't know if there's been, there's maybe one other individual night that I can point to, which had such an extraordinary artistic influence on me. That work just meant so much. It was so breathtakingly beautiful, and it wasn't even necessarily that the content that they were showing was something which was interesting. You got a couple clips of planes, and you got a couple filters, and all the rest of it. It was watching them make those decisions in real time. It was watching them improvise that way that was so inspiring and so beautiful, and exciting, truly exciting. So I had actually, at that point, I had already done one, quote, VJ performance, unquote. And that was because someone had seen the work that I was doing with these installation pieces, these fine art pieces, right, and said, hey, your stuff might look good when we're throwing a party. Sure, and so the Halloween party at ITP in 2000 was the first time that I brought a computer and I plugged it in and I started showing the effects and the techniques that I was building. I didn't have anything even close to like an interface where I could actually make the decision in real time. I just set these things up and started to let them go. And so I'd come to the party scene from being this guy who was playing with computers, who knew a little bit about theater. Right. And after I did that, I actually started to say, okay, well, what I want to build is the system. And I want to build a system that allows me to start being flexible about how I show these pieces. And NATO's performance was just so terrible in real time that I got fairly frustrated early on and just wrote this system for showing DV clips out of the FireWire port. Okay. But when I finally bit the bullet and bought a laptop, I did it because I'd just been invited into the Jitter Alpha, and I started playing with making these with generating the same effects that I've been doing before, but with Jitter and in real time and somewhat faster. And I loved feeling like my way of dancing with the DJ was to play this instrument. Right. And I felt like it was that it took this kind of weird one-sided relationship that the dancers may have to DJs, and turning it into something where I was doing a call and response. And a couple of DJs who I was working with really saw that. There was I did a lot of work for a girlfriend boyfriend, now husband wife DJ pair named Sleepy and Boo, where they told me that that the visuals that I was doing were so interesting that they were saying, okay, that it became a call and response thing.
It upped their game a little bit, huh?
It upped their game a little bit because they thought, oh, he's doing that, I'm going to do this. Okay, he's doing that, I'm going to do this. And you so rarely see that in a club situation. I also saw that, and I saw that a lot more when I started doing a little bit more of like ambient experimental VJ performance with a guy named Sheldon Drake. I guess early performances there included with these. There was a guy named Todd Pollenberg, who's now the associate technology director for Blue Man Group, and working with him musically was also really inspiring. And I gradually built up this instrument over the course of that summer of 2002 when Jitter was in alpha and then beta, and then I realized I think somewhere around like July of that year or something like that actually what I had was something that I could possibly turn into a distributable tool, and something where that impulse that I had in grad school with NATO to educate and to evangelize was actually something that could be really great for Jitter itself. And so and the other thing, and this is kind of there were two more impulses, and the first impulse was to make it free and to keep the license absolutely free, because I'd been inspired by Spot and the Bomb. And he'd taken this absolutely beautiful piece of code and said, you can do whatever you want with it. He put it under the GPL, but I decided that I was going to do more. I decided that I was just going to go ahead and make the world a better place by assigning no license whatsoever to Dervish. Steal it, make it your own, take it apart. I don't care. Here you go. And the other thing that was a reaction to was, and this is kind of awful to say, and Johnny DeCam, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry, is that I was so annoyed about people taking the core functionality of Soft VNS and of NATO and selling these as hugely expensive programs, like the early VJ programs, VJ laptop software programs. I'm not going to go ahead and say Imagine, but I am going to point to the first and second versions of VDMX and say Jacques. And I felt like what we had here was a beautiful nascent medium, and the lower we set the bar to starting to work with these tools, the faster we'd be able to accelerate development of this medium, the faster we'd be able to actually make the tropes and the shorthands of this medium something that was understandable by a greater number of people.
Well, it's interesting because we are kind of like following the line of how I at least imagined the live visual thing going, because it's interesting the number of people I've talked to. I mean, when you saw Jeremy and Kurt, how many people were there?
30, 40.
Yeah, see, that's what I understood, but it's one of those things that has become something where an awful lot of people claim they were there. You know?
Oh, really? You've heard other people talking about that night?
Yes, I have. That specific night. The other thing is, your creation of Dervish is sort of like the starting point for an awful lot of people.
Oh God, it makes me so happy. I don't know. Aside from my kids, it's probably the thing that I'm absolutely proudest of. Is that really, like, to this day, I will talk to people who say, "Wow, you made Dervish. That was, I can't tell you how much you helped me. I actually didn't really understand how all this stuff could be bundled into these frameworks, how you could actually start doing this kind of thing until I had that, and thank you so much for sharing that code." And
well, it was one of those things where people who weren't sure how to get started could just say, "I'm going to stop worrying about learning for a second, and I just want to play." Mm-hmm. And they could bring that in and sort of have a joyful experience with it. And that was the hook that got a lot of people started. I've heard that probably a dozen times.
Oh God, it makes me so happy every time I hear that. And the key word here being joy.
Yeah.
If you're not, I feel like that is the state that I aspire to every time I sit down with the laptop and I plug in my video out, and I'm in I'm in a live situation. What I want is joy, and I'm not. I start out by trying to find a sequence that gives me joy because it just is working so well, the music, and it's so beautiful. And my article of faith is that if I hit on that, if I find the sequence, that magic thing that's giving me joy, that joy will be infectious.
Yeah.
And it's if you're working in a club situation, joy is it. I mean, that's
the thing.
That's the thing.
That's the currency.
Right? You are working to give people this transporting joy. And if you can help trigger that, if you can help bring it along, drugs or no, then you have done the right thing in that situation, and you are making the world a better place.
Right, truly. So, in the early days, what did a system look like that you would haul to a club, and how does that compare to what you would take to a club if you were doing a gig tonight?
I went from G4 Tower running DV streams out of the FireWire port,
right,
to a laptop running S-Video out of the built-in, sadly long lamented S-Video port.
I still miss those.
I do too, and I had for a while a fairly complicated system that I actually dragged around. Probably the most ambitious system that I ever took to gigs was laptop, video mixer, DVD player, frame grabber, and an analog monitor and camera. And I would actually use I would take the four streams that I would mix with the V4 would be the DVD player, the camera output, my mixing of the camera output and the DVD player, and my I think there was one more sequence that I'd bring in, but mostly I would sort of set these situations up where I was actually doing feedback transformations on feedback transformations on feedback transformations from the analog and from the digital world.
Oh, so would you pipe the computer signal back into the mixer for a potential feedback pattern?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, and I would also use the output of the mixer on a little like crappy 13-inch television that I had a camera pointed at.
Oh, sure.
So I'd have like digital feedback transformations going on inside the laptop, and then analog feedback transformations going back into the mixer. And I had this tendency to bring a whole bunch of balls and throw them up in the air and do my very best to grab them and take it out. And it's the move to HD has made this a lot less easy, because not the least of which is because feedback. It doesn't look quite as good with the cameras now. That's for one. Like being able to use an analog camera into like a DFG, into an imaging source frame grabber,
right,
had a specific look that you just can't really get as much anymore. But it's I was at this kind of awkward stage, and the awkward stage was going from the old like tape and camera based VJs of the mid 90s,
right,
and then you've got the modern OpenGL kits. So I was trying to get the best of both worlds on there, and do transformations in the computer and transformations outside of the computer, and see where I could come with it. And it actually, on a downside, sometimes it would be really messy. Like I remember if I brought too many balls to throw up in the air, it was definitely possible for me to have nights where nothing felt right.
Right.
And that's when you have the practice that I have, where you don't really know what you're going to end up doing. Where you don't really have like, okay, well, I found that if it's this, I do this preset, then it's going to work. And I built when Pattern first came out, I built in this very complicated preset manager and preset saver. And after about 2 or 3 performances, I freaking scrapped it because presets were making me lazy.
Oh, sure.
In weird ways, and like I would say, okay, well, here's this preset. Okay, I guess I crossfed to it. All right, that looks like it did before. Okay, here's this preset. All right, well, what do I do now? And I found that throwing myself off of a cliff and saying you have to make all of these balls work was something that would more often result in the magic, in the joy, than if I knew what I was doing when I walked into the situation.
Yeah, it's funny, and I'm always curious talking to people who do live performance because there's this scenario with digital systems where conceivably you can manage risk. You can basically say, I can set it up so that the system mitigates any potential errors on my part and gives me what would be an error-free performance. But then, in fact, so I mean, even now, I do a lot of live performances that are feedback-oriented. And, like, I map it to sliders on a controller, and there's, like, about 2% of the slider range that's actually valuable. But I can't, expand it because when I change this other thing, that 2% changes. And you're constantly sort of like doing this high wire act, trying to balance the things and then catching it before it goes out of control. And so I do that because I found if I press the button and get there, it doesn't inspire me in any way. It'll be error free, but it'll also be sort of magic free. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
You better believe it. You hit the nail right on the head right there. When you're dealing with parameter ranges, if you predefine a parameter range and sticks you into a box, and you can't, like, sometimes I'll find out like that if I waver between a fluctuation between, say, I don't know, 41 degrees and 45 degrees, then it has this specific look, especially when I've got like this noise filter going on. Right. But that range of 41 to 45 is going to be utterly meaningless when I'm in another situation where there's a different kind of feedback transform. And so I want to be able to have like an easy control on there. And I found that I was getting lost in presets. And so it was sort of like, it wasn't a particularly surprising thing for me to say I'm scrapping this whole pattern system that I have here. I mean, the downside is that if occasionally the machine will crash, and if the machine crashes, then sometimes it will take me 5 to 7 minutes to get everything sort of back rolling. Like I have a couple of QuickTime videos and things like that I'll put up on a full screen.
Okay, so you have some sort of backup plan.
I have a backup plan, like exactly. There's this clip of an octopus walking on the seafloor that I can't stop looking at. But that'll keep people entertained for a little bit. But then, I try to go.
Note to all New Yorkers: if you're at a Goldberg performance and you see the walking octopus, you know what happened.
There was just a catastrophic cock up. But I really and this is, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's a tough decision to make, and it's a tough realization to make that I'm not in a situation where I'm comfortable with having these very neatly placed effects and neatly placed boxes, and I have to kind of throw myself off the cliff every time.
Right.
It makes me very difficult to sell as a performer in some ways because sometimes it doesn't work.
Right.
But it has brought me more joy working that way than it would be if I was simply moving from preset to preset and knew what was going on. I mean, I have the patch that I use in performance every single time has elements from 2001. There are boxes and lines in there that are 12 years old. And it's because I've set this thing up in a way where I can continually know where to go in the labyrinth to find tunnels I have not yet explored.
Sure.
And that's a pretty exciting thing for me. That means that I can keep on reading this book, and there's story, but it's not really a story. I can keep on flipping through these pages and see things that I haven't seen before, and that to me is that makes it such a beautiful system.
Well, that's kind of interesting, because one of the things that comes up when I talk to a lot of people is the idea of shiny objects versus knowledge in depth. And one of the things I feel like, both when I teach and when I work with other people who are starting to learn different systems, is that there's this tendency. Right now, there's a new technology that comes out every week, and it can be really exciting, and to jump from one to the next always gives you something exciting and new. But you talk about the exploration, and I'm going to jump to another bad analogy, but let's say that you wanted to explore the sewer system of New York. I'm sure that would be awesome, but you can't really do it by going to various manholes and opening them up and peering at them. You have to get in there.
You got to get in there. You got to get dirty.
And it takes time, and it takes commitment, and it's one of the things that the constantly new technology that's available makes. It doesn't make it difficult, but it's distracting. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure. I mean, what's interesting to me is to hear that you're using some constructs that are 12 years old, and you still feel like you haven't explored all the edges. That's really exciting to me.
Yeah,
because I think
it's exciting to me too. Like those situations where I'm like on a stage and all of a sudden I've stumbled upon something. I'm like, wow, god damn, that looks great. Wow, okay,
right? How did that happen?
Yeah, that happened. And I'll take a screenshot so I can see so I just can get a snapshot of what the parameters look like.
Right.
But I deliberately eliminated patter from my patch.
That's really interesting, because so often when I see people who are like making their first system, that's where their focus is. They'll do 3 knobs, but make sure that the patter thing is super nailed down, because I think early in someone's use, there is such a fear of making a mistake that the risk management becomes you at least think it's important.
Risk management, and there's a lazy way of thinking about this in some ways. Like when you do visuals in clubs, people aren't necessarily. There's very few people who are going to the clubs for the visuals.
Right.
They're adding to the whole of it. Like let's be honest here. The center point of attention is the guy who's actually making the music happen. What you are doing in a club situation with video is you are enhancing that, and so it's the way of sort of forgiving. Like if you go off the cliff and your parachute doesn't open. It's lazy, but sadly kind of sometimes true to say, well, no one was really looking at it anyway. Like they didn't know that they were looking at it, but they were looking at it.
Right.
So,
it was part of the whole experience.
Part of the whole experience. Exactly.
Interesting. So, when you define your work, I actually went and I looked at your CV, and the way that you kind of badge your work is as time-based art. What does that mean, and how does that fit into sort of like this embracing of the happy accident?
My work is all happy accidents. Absolutely all happy accidents. Happy accidents that happen because I set up a process and I set up parameters for that process and I watched it evolve in real time. One thing that I love doing, and I know that this is also like a personal a goal of people like Gregory, is setting up what happens when you have oscillators that go out of phase. If you set up a couple of very, very slow oscillators, like in a geometrical feedback transformation, and you watch those oscillators drift, and you watch what happens as those things move from being in lockstep to being away from lockstep, then such extraordinarily beautiful things can result. And that's part of the fun of saying that I'm time-based art here, because I I like watching these processes resolve, and those processes do not resolve unless you have the patience to sit there and see them through, and that takes time, and that's in time. And I Time-based art is sort of it's a bit of a lazy definition because like there's so many, like, what's a movie? A movie is time-based art, but I mean, sometimes I feel like what I make and what I do is a little bit closer sometimes to genetic engineering or gardening. Because I don't say, I want to tell this story, I want to make it look like this. I don't wake up in the middle of the night and say, I want something that looks like this. I wake up in the middle of the night and I think, oh, if I took the numbers that were defining this kind of process and I actually slowly mapped them increasingly over time to this kind of process, that might be kind of beautiful and kind of cool. But I never think about the results. I only think about the process of how I'd like to try to make something next.
Sure. Now, people who do more linear, like movie making, would say that what that lacks is a defined narrative. But my experience is that what you're actually doing is you're releasing the viewer to be able to create their own narrative out of the work.
Exactly. And I try very, very hard to never put any recognizable shapes into the work that I'm doing so that people's brains can still assemble what they want. Like, I don't want everyone to have the exact same reaction to what I'm showing. I want it to trigger them thinking about other things and trigger them not even thinking about, but feeling. I feel like if I don't give anyone any narrative hooks whatsoever, if I don't give anyone any recognizable things that are nouns,
right?
If I don't give them any nouns, then what I'm going to get and what I'm going to be able, what people are going to create are feelings, and I feel like that's the ideal, that's the goal. There.
That's really interesting. You let them define their own. Sure,
I want them to define it. It'll speed up their heartbeat. It'll cause it'll cause a flush. It'll make people have these own individual experiences that are physiological as opposed to narrative and coherent.
Right. Now, one of the things that you've been involved with is a number of sort of like high-profile projects that actually are nouns. So I'm thinking of like the dragon car thing from Burning Man, which I think is one of your most well-known pieces of work that you've done. But you've done a lot of installation work and museum type pieces. How do you take something that is, sort of like shows up in your lap as a noun? Mm-hmm. And how do you redirect some of that energy?
Well, because it's problem solving. The dragon was problem solving in the sense that I had a certain number of fixtures. What I was told was, you're getting these fixtures, make it work. And I knew that that it had to be something where there was the design for the dragon. I did the lighting design. The concept of the dragon, and the lead artist on that is a guy named Teddy Lowe. The lead constructor was a genius builder and welder by the name of Ryan Doyle. And I really came in. I started out as just the manager on that one, and it was the second round of it when we actually took it to Burning Man a second time. Then I was able to actually build a lighting design the way I felt like it should have been done. And well, okay, every job is a little bit different. I can say, oh, well, all of my work is problem solving, and that is to a certain extent true, but the problems themselves are sort of widely varying. And so I knew that what I wanted, the direction that I wanted to go with the dragon for its lighting design was, I wanted to put together 3 or 4 different running patterns whose interaction and whose superimposition would create a wide variety of looks and feels.
Sure.
And here's a chase, and here's an individualized fade, and here's a strobe, and here's and if you put all of those things together in certain different ways, then you start to see the magic. And I've done work for other people where someone said, "Oh, I want you to build this thing, but I want to be able to actually to work with you to build these looks." So what I would do is actually build the systems. I love building the systems where I put together a couple of very basic building blocks in a way that people who aren't Max programmers but have a vision can actually steer these systems to help their vision. And it's very much a non-ego driven thing, except for my own personal like joy of solving those problems. But I really like facilitating other people to create. And I don't think there's any downside in that at all. It makes me extraordinarily happy if I can make something that people use to make something.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense, right?
That's a big overriding joy in a lot of my work, is I've done performances where I set up things that were basically run on like a MIDI keyboard or something like that, and I would just grab people in the audience and say, do something interesting, and then layer those on top of it. But I love it. I love being able to use the tools that I know well to help other people make art that they also feel invested in.
Given that in your work you sort of embrace risk and you like to walk the high wire a little bit, what has been the scariest or most uncomfortable situations that you found yourself in?
When I can't find something that works. And I've been in situations where I'm just sort of noodling around, and all it feels like is I'm just doing stupid noodling around. I'm walking around pathways that I've seen before. I'm going down certain. I'm using certain tropes that seem to me stale, and that's scary when you feel like. When I feel like I'm just going through the motions, that's a terrifying point, because I just don't know when I'm in a situation like that, and like I'm trying all sorts of different things. I'm just like, oh, it just looks so. This is stale. This is boring. This is sad, and I have to be somewhat discreet about that, because I'm in the situation where I am. Where I'm supposed to be working and creating, and that's when those are the moments where I regret throwing away presets.
Right.
But I mean, it doesn't always work. But the always present ability for it to simply not work is something that makes the working so much more successful and more joyous. So the risk is there that what I'm building is just going to be boring, and I'm never going to find that. I'm never going to find that transformative moment. That is an omnipresent risk. Like I said, it keeps me from being someone who's good to book reliably.
Well, we won't tell anybody about that,
except on the podcast. That's fine.
Joshua, it's been a fantastic opportunity to talk with you.
Darwin, it's always a pleasure.
And do you have any last words for anyone?
I don't know if everyone understands this, but the help patches are there to be broken. Like, break the examples. The best thing you can possibly do is to take something that you don't understand, take a patch that you don't understand that you have access to, and break it in some way. Because happy accidents are how I've made almost all of the really good art that I've made since I started dealing with real-time work in audio and video. And if I didn't have happy accidents, if I didn't have things that I could break that I didn't understand that I was playing with, then I wouldn't have been able to make this work.
Well, fantastic advice. Thanks a lot, Joshua. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Darwin.
Have a great day.
You too.
Bye. Well, that was incredible. One thing I find is that every time I'm around Joshua, it's just exploding with energy, and that interview was certainly another example of that. I find him to be a really interesting person to talk about just about anything, but when you're able to speak with him about his working process, it's pretty awesome. So that's it for this week. Tune in next week for another great interview. See you then.